Hello there, faithful listener. You've tuned in to Season 7 of the Bible Explained podcast. So make sure to grab your cup of coffee, because today we are going to be discussing the book of 2 Samuel. Hey, faithful listeners, welcome to the Bible Explained podcast. On this lovely hump day, we're going to be talking about a very interesting portion of scripture today that is a story that was never actually talked about in scripture, but is brought up right here. And also there's a potential inconsistency that we will address today as well. So let's read verses 1 through 14 of 2 Samuel 21. And as I always do, I'll be reading from the WEB. Grab your cup of coffee or your cup of tea this morning and join along with me. There was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David sought the face of Yahweh. Yahweh said, "It is for Saul and for his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death." The king called to the Gibeonites and said to them, Now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites, and the children of Israel had sworn to them, and Saul sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. And David said to the Gibeonites, What should I do for you? And with what should I make atonement that you may bless Yahweh's inheritance? The Gibeonites said to him, It is no matter of silver or gold between us and Saul, or his house. Neither is it for us to put any man to death in Israel. He said, I will do for you whatever you say. They said to the king, The man who consumed us, and who devised against us, that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the borders of Israel, let 7 men of his sons be delivered to us, and we will hang them up to Yahweh in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of Yahweh. The king said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of Yahweh's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. But the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mahalathite. He delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the mountain before Yahweh. All 7 of them fell together. They were put to death in the days of the harvest, in the first days at the beginning of barley harvest. Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock, from the beginning of the harvest until water poured down on them from the sky. She allowed neither the birds of the sky to rest on them by day, nor the animals of the field by night. David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. So David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the street of Beth-shan, where the Philistines had hanged them, in the day that the Philistines killed Saul in Gilboa. And he brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son. They also gathered the bones of those who were hanged. They buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son in the country of Benjamin in Zelah, in the tomb of Kish his father, and they performed all that the king commanded. After that, God answered the prayer for the land. All right, there's certainly a lot we can talk about in today's portion of scripture. A lot of very interesting things going on. So first and foremost, there is a famine going on in the days of David. It said it went on for 3 years, year after year. And it's really interesting that David does not ask God about this famine until it hits year 3. Now, famines were not uncommon in the days of David. You know, they didn't have the modern technology that we have nowadays. They didn't have greenhouses or pesticides or growing lamps or anything like that. They just had the outdoors. And whatever happened, happened. So famines were not uncommon in the days of David. But for a famine to go on for 3 years, David is beginning to wonder if there is some kind of sin that Israel did. Now, thinking about this from my own garden, I have had some very bad years doing gardening where nothing seems to grow right. For example, last year, my strawberries, they did really well at the beginning, but suddenly this bug, I don't know what kind of a bug it was, but it came in and it just destroyed my strawberries, and there was nothing I could do to fix it. It was at the end of the strawberry season anyway, so I just let the bugs eat their strawberries after trying to get rid of them, and that's kind of what it was. But now this year, my strawberries are doing great. You know, like I've had a lot of strawberries over the years, and they're in their second bloom right now, so I've been getting strawberries almost every day. But for my strawberries to do poorly for 3 years in a row, like very poorly, where I'm hardly getting anything, I would begin to wonder if I'm just doing something wrong but I'm just a novice gardener. I'm not a professional farmer. But David's people were professional farmers, and they would have known what to do in order to grow things for that season. So now that a famine is going on for 3 years, David is like, uh-oh, Israel must have done something to sin. Because God had specifically said in the Old Testament that he would begin to take his hand of blessing off of the nation of Israel if they committed sins that went unpunished. So David seeks out the face of Yahweh after 3 years. Now, it probably would have been very helpful if David would have just, asked God and in the first year of famine. It would have saved him a lot of trouble. It reminds me of that song, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. The chorus goes, "Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear, all because we do not carry everything to God in prayer." And I love that song because it's so true. How much pain do we go through? How much unnecessary suffering do we just endure just because we don't take everything to God in prayer? We could probably save ourselves a whole lot of trouble if we just prayed to God immediately about everything, but we forget to do it. So David didn't really seek out God's guidance until year 3 of this famine. And almost immediately after David seeks out God's guidance, it says that Yahweh responded to him. It seems like no time passed at all. It says, David sought the face of Yahweh and Yahweh said. So basically the second that David asks God what's going on, God answers him. Yahweh said, "It is for Saul and for his bloody house because he put the Gibeonites to death." Now, apparently, this happened, and we don't have any record of this happening in Scripture. Scripture doesn't talk about Saul apparently going after the Gibeonites. Now, the reason this was so bad, what Saul had done, was because the Gibeonites were the only people allowed to live in the land of Israel other than the Israelites. Everybody else, when Israel first took the land of Canaan, everybody else was supposed to be driven out, except the Gibeonites. Because back in the book of Joshua, in Joshua chapter 9, Joshua, one of the first judges of Israel, had made a promise to the Gibeonites, because the Gibeonites actually tricked the Israelites, but I'm not going to get into that story. Joshua made a promise to the Gibeonites that he would not drive them out of the land. And that was a lasting promise forever. So the Gibeonites were supposed to be allowed to stay in the land with the Israelites. And this is how we know that God takes vows very, very seriously. Because in Joshua chapter 9, when Joshua first made that promise with the Gibeonites, that was like 400 years prior to this. And yet, God was remembering that vow from 400 years ago and expecting Israel to keep it. So God takes vows very, very seriously, and we should as well. So God sends a famine to Israel because of this terrible thing that they had done to the Gibeonites. Apparently, Saul had gone and just slaughtered them for no reason other than for his zeal for the children of Israel. That is what it says here in verse 2. It says, David called the Gibeonites and said to them, then it gives this like little backstory, a very short backstory about who the Gibeonites were. It says, now the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, meaning they were not Israelites, but of the remnant of the Amorites, and the children of Israel had sworn to them, meaning had made a promise with them that they would not kill them or do anything to hurt them. They would let them remain in the land of Israel. But Saul sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. Now, what's funny here is Scripture actually differentiates between Israel and Judah. So you see this division beginning to happen even in the times of David, where Israel is separating itself from Judah. So just keep that in mind as we go more and more into Israel's history. It's already beginning to happen. But Saul, because he had a zeal, it says, for the Israelites, decided to go and kill the Gibeonites anyway and basically drive them out of the land of Israel. This was very bad. And David knew that this was very bad. He knew, because the second that David hears what Saul had done to the Gibeonites, he's like, uh-oh, I need to fix this right now. And that is why King David calls to the Gibeonites and asks them, what should I do for you? And with what should I make atonement that you may bless Yahweh's inheritance? So he's like, how can I possibly make this up to you after this slaughter that Saul has done to your families? What can I possibly do for you? What will make you feel peaceful again? So the Gibeonites said to David, they were very respectful here. They say, it is no matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house, but it is not for us to put any man to death in Israel. So they say to him, we don't want silver or gold because that's not going to make up for our lost family members, for the people that Saul has slaughtered. It can't make up for it. But because we're Gibeonites, we have no right to put any man to death here in Israel. But David says, he's like, no, I will do whatever you ask. Let me make this right for you. So they say to the king, Saul, who consumed us and devised against us that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the borders of Israel, let 7 of the men of his sons be delivered to us, and we will hang them up to Yahweh in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of Yahweh. Even though Saul killed countless members of them, they only ask for 7 of Saul's descendants. And David gives it to him. And you might be like, well, why did David do this? It's not really fair for Saul's grandchildren or Saul's sons to be killed in the place of Saul. Is it actually fair? Well, don't forget that Saul's sons, many of them were still a problem for David, first and foremost. And secondly, many of them had been in battle with Saul and were complicit to what Saul was doing and possibly even helped Saul in this cause. And Saul had many sons. We don't know exactly how many sons he had, but he clearly had sons with concubines because David actually finds a couple of those sons with concubines that Saul had. So David, it says in verse 7, spared Mephibosheth. Remember Mephibosheth, he was the son of Jonathan, and he was also basically like a family member to David. And David had made a promise to Mephibosheth that he would take care of him and bless him all the days of his life. And David was not going to go against his promise to Mephibosheth, so he did spare Mephibosheth from this fate. But it says that David found 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul. So this Rizpah lady was a concubine of Saul's, who had 2 sons named Armoni and Mephibosheth. So these 2 guys, Armoni and Mephibosheth, were direct sons of Saul, illegitimate sons. And then there was also 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Meholathite. Now, if you are remembering who Michal, the daughter of Saul, is, you might be very confused when you read this portion, because you might remember that Michal was actually married to David and had no sons. So how all of a sudden can she be married to Adriel and have given him 5 sons? Well, what happened here is that the Masoretic text, which is one of the ancient manuscripts of the Bible, said Michal, and so many of the translators used the Masoretic text to translate the Bible into our modern English. However, the Septuagint and also the Syriac, which are other ancient manuscripts of Scripture, use the word Merab, which happened to be Michal's sister. Well, it's very likely, actually, that Merab had died, and Michal had taken in the 5 sons of Merab and basically adopted them and raised them as her own kids. That is what some people say. However, Scripture does not specifically state that, but it's very clear that these kids, these 5 sons, were actually Merab's children and not Michal's children. And if you have a different version of Scripture, suppose you're reading out of the ESV, it'll definitely say that these were Merab's children, not Michal's. So just to address that, anyway, Merab's 5 sons, who were Adriel's children, were delivered also to the Gibeonites. So now the Gibeonites have the 7 children that they asked for of Saul's descendants. It says they hanged them on the mountain before Yahweh, and all 7 of them fell together. They were put to death in the days of harvest, in the first days at the beginning of the barley harvest. So this would have been in the springtime. In the month of April, most likely, was when these 7 sons were put to death by the Gibeonites. So the Gibeonites now have their retribution. They now have their judgment after what happened to them, with Saul basically slaughtering them. Now, Rizpah, who was the concubine of Saul and the mother of 2 of the guys that had died here, it says she took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock from the beginning of harvest until the water poured down on them from the sky. She allowed neither birds of the sky to rest on them by day, nor the animals of the field by night. So Rizpah, the concubine, was so distressed over what happened to her 2 sons and also to the house of Saul that she decided to camp out near the bodies where the bodies were laying and basically not allow any birds to land on them and not allow any wild animals at night to come near the bodies. So she was on 24/7 guard of these bodies from the time of April all the way until the harvest, until the rainy season, is what it says. So Rizpah was really dedicated. And this also shows that the Gibeonites refused to bury these bodies, which was considered to be very appalling. Back in these days, you don't just leave a body out to die. And Rizpah was doing this to show that she was mourning after her sons and after the household of Saul. And David ends up hearing about what Rizpah is doing, and this is months that Rizpah is doing this. David hears about it and decides to give them a proper burial. Meanwhile, he also decides to give Saul and Jonathan a proper burial as well. Because remember how Saul and Jonathan died? The Philistines killed them, took their bodies into Beth Shan, and then hung them up on a wall. Well, the Israelites of Jabesh Gilead went in and actually fought off the Philistines and rescued the bodies of Jonathan and Saul and then took them back and then buried them. So David decides to take the bones of Jonathan and Saul and give them a truly proper burial. And then also the bodies of these 7 men as well. So it says in verse 12, David went and took the bones of Saul, the bones of Jonathan his son, from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the street of Beth Shan, where the Philistines had hanged them in the day that the Philistines killed Saul in Gilboa. And he brought them up from there, the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son. They also gathered the bones of those who were hanged, so the 7 men. They buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son in the country of Benjamin in Zelah, in the tomb of Kish his father, and they performed all that the king commanded. After that, God answered the prayer for the land. So God gave justice to the Gibeonites for what Saul had done to them. This proves, from an Old Testament standpoint, that God truly cares about every single human being. A lot of times people will look at the Old Testament and say, oh, well, that's only for the Israelites, or God only really cared about the Israelites in the Old Testament, but that's not true. There are so many instances of God caring for foreigners and caring for people who are not Israelites in the Old Testament, and this is just another part of it. God was willing to punish Israel for the sake of the Gibeonites, who were not Israelite men and women. God was willing to do that because injustice had been done to the Gibeonites. God is love, but he is also justice, and he cares very much about justice. And it's very clear in Scripture that eventually everybody will get the justice that they deserve. Faithful listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you didn't mind the sound of my generator turning on. I'm often recording when the generator turns on, I realized, because I think almost every single week, the generator switches on during the time that I am recording, which is my fault because I know what time it switches on and I probably shouldn't record during that time, but I happen to forget every single Monday. All right, guys, I will see you all tomorrow for another episode from the book of Romans. And as I say at the end of every single podcast episode, because it's true, happy listening and God bless.